Thank you so much for tuning in to the end of year special of the Equiano pod. I am so delighted to be joined by three fantastic women. We have Ada Akpala, who, as many of you know, is head of content at the Equiano project. We have patient Xina, who is a YouTuber and social commentator, and Ayishat Akanbi, who is a fashion stylist and commentator. So we have lots of discussions that we're going to get into today. One of the things we want to do on this special is take a look back at all of the controversies and conflicts and different debates that have been shaping the public conversation about race, culture and politics. And so I think we're just going to get straight into it. So I think one of the biggest ones that happened, I don't know if everybody else would agree, was the Ngozi Fulani controversy. And just to give a quick rundown for if people haven't followed it, but I think most people would have seen it. Essentially, this is a campaigner, a charity worker who went to a reception in the palace. I think that was right. And she met a royal, Lady Hussey, Lady Suzanne Hussey. And she was donned in, this is Ngozi Fulani, she was donned in a kind of African tribal inspired clothing. And Lady Hussey, from the nobility that she is, was curious in asking her where she was from. So she asked her kind of repeatedly, and depending on what your perspective is on it, she was engaging in a microaggression, or some people were saying that she was just genuinely curious. And long story short, Ngozi took to Twitter afterwards, and all hell broke loose. It essentially meant that Lady Hussey was forced to resign, I think. And many people saw it as an example of the deep-rooted underlying racism still at the heart of the British monarchy. And and other people saw it obviously very, very, very differently. So I think we'll start with you, Ada. What was your reaction to this controversy?
I think my first reaction is like when this happens a lot, when it's happened before. So a quite seemingly innocent question to me, something like, where are you from? Something that to me means that someone is curious about your background. Maybe they've seen how you present yourself. So they just want to know a little bit more, have that connection, break the ice kind of thing. And that was just blown completely out of proportion. Now, the fact that she did it repeatedly and she asked repeatedly, I think like everyone, that was, okay, what's your deal here? If someone isn't willing, it doesn't matter how much you're trying to, connect with them or be curious about them. They're not willing to share that part of themselves with you, right? So let it go. So I think the problem was she kept pushing and insisting and asking when someone wasn't willing to cooperate. But I think that doesn't take away the fact that someone was genuinely wanting to know a little bit more about you, and you could have just said, which you ended up doing anyway, saying she was like from 3 different places, isn't it? At the end of it all, Caribbean, African heritage, or British nationality and all that. Why was that so hard to do in the first place?
Yeah, well, this is the thing for me, because when I read the transcript, I felt that some people could say, oh, she should have just let it go. She clearly didn't want to answer. But at the same time, I was like, well, it seems like she's being slightly difficult. If you actually read the transcript, some of the things she says, well, she's like, oh, I don't know. They didn't leave a record in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. That is quite a provocative response to say to just somebody that is asking you where you're from. What do you think, Aisha?
Yeah, no, completely. I saw it the same way. I thought it was complete. She knew exactly the question that was being asked. And the problem is, a lot of the time, is that people are asked that question and they know what they're implying. However, I think many people have this assumption that by asking the question, you are suggesting that they don't belong here. Because often, where are you from is one of the questions that I first ask many people, especially if I know they have an accent or, they're of a different race and things like that. And most of the time when I ask other black people where they're from, they might say, do you mean where do I live, or where do I, what's my ethnic background? And so we know the question that's being asked, but I think she wanted to be deliberately provocative to make a point. I think it's always really interesting to me, the people who pride themselves on celebrating their culture, are the ones who are most offended about when you inquire where this culture is from. I think, for a lot of people, the type of outfit she was wearing was maybe reminiscent to, maybe their closest reference would have been Coming to America.
Mm.
And I think with that, you would imagine someone, wearing shells and things like that would be quite up for talking about their heritage. And so, yeah, I do think, when you do look at the transcript, I think, yeah, there is this point of, which I understand of, maybe she should have let it go. But I think maybe for Lady Hussey, I think maybe for Lady Hussey, it was more kind of like, maybe she's not understanding what I'm saying. I think, you would expect maybe someone like that to be more eloquent and just say, what's your ethnic background? If that's the question that you're asking. But yeah, I just think there was a deliberate point that I think she wanted to make. I think where she was as well, the location of where she was, I think was also really important, because I think it's very easy when you have a certain worldview to think of, the British, to think of the palace as, the heart of, colonial attitudes and racism and bigotry. And so I do think she probably went in with a perception and viewed the question through that lens.
And also, Patience, actually, when you read a bit more into it, she actually changed her name in later life to have a name that resembled one that could be perceived of as more African. So if you look at some of her background, she seems to be associated with different Pan-African movements as well. So actually, in a strange way, there was almost something, she was trying to wear her identity very strongly on her sleeve in a way that, would ask questions for a lot of people. What do you say to that argument?
Yeah, I think because of Ngozi Fulani's background as well, she is of Caribbean heritage, I believe, and I do think that for her, if you look at the detail of her story, like she went to university and she also studied African studies, so I think that there is also an element of that where the exaggerated outfits and the changing of the name is kind of like similar to some Black Americans I've seen who've changed their names from they've changed their last name or something like that because they don't want that tie to their like slave masters or whoever enslaved their ancestors. So I think that there is an element of her wanting to reconnect with a sense of a lost identity, but then at the same time, as you said rightly, you can't simultaneously want to wear your identity with so much pride, etc., at the same time be offended when people ask you about it. Because this is an argument I've heard people say, which I agree with. You can't champion multiculturalism yet simultaneously be upset at people being curious about multiple cultures and being curious about your background and where you come from. Because if you're trying to, if those conversations are not acceptable, then how can you simultaneously say that multiculturalism is something that should be celebrated? Because we can't talk about the multiculturalism that we're supposed to be celebrating. It doesn't make any sense.
If anything, I think it displays a lack of pride in your culture to receive it in that way.
No, one of the things you've made, the points you just made, Ada, I think is a really important one about it depends on who you ask. Because growing up, and it's not I don't know if it's as much anymore, but I remember growing up amongst Black people, they'll say, I'm Jamaican, I'm Nigerian. Like even if they were born in Britain, even if they had British citizenship. And actually oftentimes amongst ethnic minority people, they often, rightly or wrongly, strongly identify with their ancestral or ethnic heritage more than they would Britishness as such. And actually, as someone that, sees myself as reasonably patriotic, I often am treated with suspicion by other ethnic minority people for actually saying that I think that Britain is, a great place to live. I'm proud to be British. And therefore, I think it really depends on the political context. And I think when it came to Ngozi Fulani, at least what I saw, I felt that it was intentionally creating something quite provocative when it didn't necessarily need to be. And ultimately, it led to this, quite elderly woman that didn't seem to have any real massive public profile before resigning. And, that's one of the things I really worry about this conversation. It can explode so quickly without any care or consequence for the impact of, the people that are essentially being, harangued in the public sphere.
I agree, but I also think that's the responsibility of the people who are around Lady Hussey, like for the people who asked her to step down. I think that people can behave how they want, but ultimately they are enabled by people who are in powerful positions who accept these kind of like unsympathetic interpretations of these kind of racial interactions. Because I think if we didn't have a culture that made people feel comfortable to make these accusations because they know something's going to happen. I don't think that these kind of things would happen, because I don't think you should have to step down for taking an interest in someone's background. But the fact that there were consequences for that shows that we're kind of fostering a culture where that kind of behaviour is now rewarded, which is of course going to lead to more people thinking it's justified to feel that way about those kind of things.
But do you think that sometimes, though, even though I think institutions need to be much more like strong in their position, I think lots of them are just genuinely scared, because even the monarchy, whatever people's thoughts are on it, it has actually experienced obviously accusations of racism quite strongly in the last few years in regards to Meghan and Harry, and so I think they're quite sensitive to accusations of racism, and especially if you've got ethnic minority people who have the loudest voices saying that this is racist, this is disgraceful. It's hard to really feel confident to push back against that. You will just capitulate because you don't have any. They might feel like they just don't have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, but I do think the discourse is changing though, because one thing I found really interesting about the Ngozi Fulani situation is most of the people who were criticising her were black. So
really?
Yeah,
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
We're in different parts of the
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I saw a lot of comments, a lot of people criticising for the same reason you're saying, which is, well, if you're proud of your heritage, why are you ashamed of it? Because I think there are some people who interpret it as, well, why are you ashamed to not for not being ethnically English? Like, why are you ashamed of your heritage or your background if that's what you are? Like, I think some people do interpret it in different ways. I think some people interpret it as a racist microaggression, but I think some people also interpret this evasion to the question as kind of showing, like, do you have some kind of disdain for your heritage that you don't want to embrace it and stuff like that. So I think that's probably where some black people were criticising her from. But also, it's not common for black people to find taking an interest in someone's culture background. It's not common for people to find that offensive, so I think a lot of people also just thought the whole situation was blown out of proportion and ridiculous. So I did see a lot of black people criticising her. I didn't see that many supporting her, but like you said, maybe...
But then also, maybe that is people who aren't commentators. So a lot of the people that you observed who were criticising a lot of the people who were criticising the reaction and her reaction, were they commentators?
Yeah, I mean, Esther Krakow was one.
Oh, but she's on.
Also someone who probably shares our views.
Yeah. So she's more on the she's more on the
critical. She's the only one whose name I know. Okay. But like, I did see people, social commentators talking.
Yeah, I did see a few online, but there were already people that were quite skeptical of those kinds of things anyway. So I wouldn't say that they were the people that generally are the most prominent anti-racist kind of discussion. Or I saw like someone called Chris Rose on Twitter and Esther Krakow, but again, I think that they were already part of a direction of travel that was skeptical. But yeah, I think I mean that is interesting. That I would have liked to have seen much more of that, because I feel like when the conversation happened, there was just this one view. But it is good that more people are criticizing it.
No, I think they definitely are, because when I made a video on it, I had a lot of like black Brits in my comments saying, yeah, like, I'm proud to be Nigerian. Like,
definitely Nigerian, because of the name combination as well, right?
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that many Nigerian people, because Fulani is an ethnic group in Nigeria. I don't know where Ngozi's from.
Igbo.
Oh, okay. So a lot of Nigerians, they were like, wait, make this make sense. Yeah. I don't want to get too personal, but that was another thing that I felt, Kehinde Andrews, do people know? Like, Kehinde in Yoruba means you're a twin. So you'll be Kehinde and Taiwo, but his surname was Andrews, and he's actually Caribbean heritage. And I was like...
I think it's the same Abraham X. Kennedy as well.
Yeah, and I was like, how does this make sense? I was like, where's his twin? I don't know. Maybe he has one.
I think there's like a conflict, this constant struggle, inner struggle with a lot of, let's say, black people, black Caribbeans especially. I see it with black Americans as well. Is this kind of reluctance to admit that actually I am British, I am American, but if I admit that, then what am I admitting to? Does that mean that I'm taking the good and the bad, and this is the bad that I blow up and say is the worst, kind of thing? So I think these people that get so offended, they have to make peace with their identity, their national identity and their ethnic identity, and it can mix together and it can become a whole, and that's okay. But a lot of people are reluctant to do that because, of course, of the political and the ideological implications.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because again, I don't know if this is a Nigerian thing, I'm not sure, but I've never really seen any conflict between being British and being of Nigerian heritage, and I think part of that is because I you know, recognize the complexity of like all ethnicities, all nationalities, that, you know, even in the history of Nigeria, there's been some great things that have happened. There's also been some very bad things that have happened. And that's just like the human story. And I think if you, like, one of the things I think might be difficult for people, if you have those identity issues around ethnicity and race, being British and not being English heritage, is, you know, you see like Britain is only a source of kind of bad in the world. And you struggle to reconcile that, you know, with the history. And I just think if you just accept that actually all nations, all people have good, have evil, have triumph and horrific things, then you kind of accept that as a human universal, regardless of what country or what nationality you're from. What do you think?
But I also think that's also down to education, though, because I think a lot of people are not fully educated on the history. And I think that, especially for some reason, it's really interesting, because we spoke about this, Ada, how it's really interesting how like places like Britain and America don't teach the full story of slavery, but yet in African countries they will teach you the full story, the good and the bad, everything, but there's no like emotional attachment to it. There's no like, oh, because of this is why this is. It's just they're so blanket, like so like upfront about it. Yeah, they talk about it like it's a matter of fact. Yeah. And I've always found that really fascinating, because they have more to lose from telling the full story of slavery because of the participation and things that Africans did to take part in the slave trade. But yet for some reason, Britain and America don't seem to teach the full story of slavery. And it's really interesting to me. What
do you mean by the full story? They don't teach the...
Like a lot of people don't... People have this idea that Europeans just went to Africa and just started grabbing black people.
Oh, yeah.
Like they don't know that Africans were actually active participants in capturing Africans and selling them to Europeans, as well as selling them to the Middle Eastern, to other Arabic slave masters and stuff. And they also don't know that Britain invested so much time and money into ending the slave trade, and was actually a lot of people lost their lives in the process of trying to stop the boats that were transporting slaves. So like they don't know any of that. They only have the idea that they just went to African countries, just took people and then just took them over to like America and all this kind of stuff. And they also don't know about the fact that Europeans were not the only ones taking part in this as well. They have no idea that Arabic countries...
Yeah, there's Arab slave trade.
But I think even when they do know about it, I think many people still find a way to frame that as coercion. They were duped. You know what I mean? There's always a way that, you know, they can offset the role that Africans played in that onto somebody else. And even when it comes to Britain ending, you know, the slave trade and things like that, even then that will still be interpreted in a cynical way. That was for money. That was for profit. That wasn't anything noble. That wasn't about morality. You know, so even these, if you are privy to the facts, there's always a way to interpret the facts that can still bring it back to something cynical.
I agree, and that's when it starts to lead to the question of, is this like a religious ideology then, in a way? Because if regardless of what evidence is given to you, you can still find a way to make it work within your ideological framework, then quite clearly your loyalties are to that ideological framework. And at what point is anything that anyone says or any evidence that's given to you going to alter your perspective? Quite clearly that's not ever going to happen. And then it raises the question of how useful are these conversations then, if we're having if that's the attitude that people have, because it's like debating with someone who's highly religious whether or not God is real. Like there's no way for you to really have that conversation with a devout like follower and believer. So so this kind of conversation should not be entering into mainstream like education systems and workplaces and stuff if it's not actually based on truth or something that's falsifiable.
No, it's true. And I think, you know, for a lot of people, it just seems like, you know, no matter what you say, they will always find a way to put it back to a very one-sided narrative around slavery and colonialism. And, you know, but the challenge is that, as you said, like, this is being transmitted within education and happening again in each generation. And, you know, and someone like myself or others, you know, want to break that cycle. You know, we want to tell a different generation that actually there's more to the story, and so on and so forth. I think that is a big challenge, kind of trying to broaden it.
And I think maybe what people aren't necessarily considering is that there is a benefit. I think there's a personal benefit to considering that part of it, as uncomfortable and as unflattering as it may be, because, you know, no one, you know, alive today was ever around for the slave trade. But however, knowing about those things can really impact your psyche. as a young person, you know. I think I remember the first time watching a film like The Amistad, or maybe catching like glimpses of Roots as a kid, and that can really sort of damage your self-esteem. But I think you can intercept that actually if that story is told more fully, because then you're not just the victim in that story, you know. And I do think this has a profound effect on someone's psyche and the way that they see themselves and the way that they view their history, if they don't think that they were just, you know,
passive actors.
Exactly.
Well, so another story that is touching upon similar themes. So there was another controversy that happened this year. Peckham Hair and Cosmetics was embroiled in a racism row after a video surfaced of, I think, the owner of the hair salon got into a kind of a conflict with a customer. So what essentially happened was she bought some hair or something like that, and then left, came back maybe the next day or something, trying to return it. And they didn't have a returns policy. And so she decided to go into the shop and start taking things. And he tried to prevent her from doing that. And there's a particular shot where he's grabbing her. And I don't know if he actually is strangling her or it just looks like that. But it didn't look good. It was quite a forceful endeavor. But the video surfaced and loads of protests gripped Peckham, of people accusing the shop owner of racism, this being an example of misogynoir, and also also saying that also about how Asian shopkeepers in particular essentially monopolize the black food and hair and products industry, whether that's like going to get African food in a shop or hair products that are predominantly targeted at black women. And there was lots of discussion saying that there is a lot of racism within the Asian community, and this was an example of it. So first reactions to this controversy.
I think when I saw the video, I did emotionally react to it just based on what I saw. I was thinking, why is a 6 foot something huge man? I didn't, as always, right? I didn't see the race of it. I just saw someone manhandling a woman. So that was the emotional kind of reaction. And I still think he was wrong how he handled the situation. However, the response of, putting her as some kind of helpless, victim was also wrong, because she obviously instigated it as well by being violent to him.
Oh yeah, she was attacking him as well.
Attacking him as well, right? She wasn't, on the ground and being beaten on kind of thing. She was also part of it. So the fact that there's always this reluctance to assign blame where blame needs to be, and it doesn't always need to be binary or one-sided. There can be a multiplicity of views and perspectives. So yes, my nuanced view got me attacked from all sides. Like the conservatives came after me, which was really horrible. It was really horrid.
Really, did they?
Of course, it was disgusting, the things they were saying about me and about her, calling her animal and a beast and things like that. And I said, okay, I can take that, but so was he, because they both lacked self-control. So yeah, it was quite...
Yeah, I did think your take was nuanced, because to be honest, I thought it was very one-sided, very binary on Twitter. It was either, she's a victim, or he is an aggressor, or whatever, or the other way around. She's a terrible person. Because to be fair, she did hit him in the face with a basket a couple times. And even after that, the handle broke off from the basket when she was hitting him, and then she started hitting him with that as well. So it was quite a crazy situation. I did think your take was quite nuanced, because you also acknowledged that yes, what she did was wrong, but at the same time, it's not the right way to handle. A shopkeeper can't just put his hands on customers,
But then at the same time, when you're being hit with a basket, it's so hard that it breaks.
I think we're talking about before that, okay. Because he had pushed, because the way it escalated is, as she was trying to leave, he tried to block her, and then after that, I think, because he was pushing her into the shop, that's when she then went to slap him, and it just went downhill from there. So I think, there are some people arguing that, well, what is he supposed to do, just let her steal from his shop? And then some people saying, he could have just called the police or something. I don't know. I think, but to be fair, he even acknowledges that the way he handled it wasn't the best, and he has apologised and stuff. But I think it's more so the reaction to the situation and the protest that really is what we need to really...
Yeah. I don't want to take this off tangent, but one of the things, this is actually why it's so frustrating that I do think the police, their lack of involvement or tackling petty crimes actually gives the way for people like shopkeepers that want to protect their business, they have to then end up taking the law into their own hands, and therefore it ends up escalating. Look, I think multiple things can be true at once. He shouldn't have manhandled her. Like, he's a big guy. If she's stealing something, is it like, even though it's completely wrong what she did, he should actually have just let her go. You kind of cut your losses in these situations. But as you said, the thing is, it's firstly that we need to condemn the fact that she was stealing, first of all. And also the reaction is shocking. Like, using, again, as we were talking about in the earlier discussion, using something like that to make a massive, huge, saying it's an example of, hundreds of years of slavery, misogynoir, all this kind of stuff.
Can we define misogynoir?
Yeah, no, this
people listening, like, what?
Well, Ada, you were the expert because you did a Radio 4 program a few weeks ago about it.
Anti-black racism. No, anti-black hatred that's intertwined with sexism. So at women, directly at black women. So oppression and prejudice and hatred towards black women.
So it's a combination of racism
and sexism. So it's a unique experience that only black women have.
Yeah, and I think that it is a contested term, like we must add, about if it's valid. But what about this? One of the things that came up in the discussion, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on, Aisha, about some people are essentially saying that Asian people have monopolized the kind of black economy. And one of the things that Ada and I were talking about when we were thinking about this conversation is that actually, in a way, like, it is true that, for example, if you want to get plantain or whatever, you're probably going to go to a shop owned by Asian people, but that's good for them. They took control of a captive market and economy there. If black people would do the same and did it successfully, no one would have a problem with that. Well, why are we having to go at Asian people for seeing a market there that they're utilizing? Is that not a good thing?
Yeah, and because I would like to ask, why aren't we owning those things?
Yeah.
What is the reason for that? I've always been interested in this, and I don't know the details. Some people will say because they have a monopoly on, let's say, the buyers and the stockists and things like that, I've heard, and I don't know how true this is, that they only sell to each other. And so they make it hard for outsiders, whether black or white, to kind of come into that industry. I'm not sure if that's the truth, but what I do know is that my whole life I have never met anybody who has any ambition to own a shop like that, or to... I just don't meet that. And is that because we look down on those kinds of things? Is that because we only assign value to certain types of work? As you said, if people see a gap in the market, they'll fill it. And so I would just maybe like to consider, why aren't we filling that market? Because I do believe at this point we certainly can. And I think the reasons why we're not, I think very much have to do with our notions, or many people's notions, should I say, of success. And I think there's issues there, but I don't know if that's something that needs to be attributed to Asian people, because if not them, someone else would have done it.
Yeah, and I also think, I don't want to, blame communities, but in my experience, so, I have locks, and, go to the hairdresser. I often find it very, very hard to get very good service when I go to different...
I want to let you finish.
Yeah. If I want to go to, like, oftentimes I want to go to a Nigerian restaurant, the service has not actually been very, very good. And, I think that we really need to be honest about, comparatively, my experiences of black-owned restaurants, black-owned hairdressers. I've spoken to my friends about it that have been shocked that I've had to call, multiple and just not getting great service. And so I do think that there is a conversation there about how black business owners actually attract customers and how that might be different in terms of expectations. I don't know if you want to...
No, so the reason I was going to comment on this is because there's a whole discourse about this currently happening online.
Oh, okay.
About black-owned businesses and the poor customer service. Because this is something that Americans are mainly pushing, because there was a famous TikTok food critic guy, this black American man. He's a food critic. He goes to different restaurants, but he basically gives very transparent, honest reviews, and he doesn't go in there himself because he doesn't want to get any special treatment. So he wants to give the most authentic reviews. So he has like friends or family go in there, whatever. So he went into this black-owned restaurant, And he was made to stand, the person who he got to order for him was made to stand outside for a while and weren't able to order. And then when they got in, he was saying that because they basically were treating their restaurant like a club. So you know how some people get rejected entry into clubs? They were trying to treat it like a club because they thought that would kind of increase demand and make people want to go because it's like an exclusive thing. But obviously it's caused a lot of issues because of people not happy with the service. So he gave an honest review about his experience. And they basically were coming after him and saying, how can you do this to black-owned businesses? You're not supporting your own people and all this kind of... It created a whole discourse. And then all of a sudden, it was like something happened. All of a sudden, black people felt empowered to finally start sharing their stories. And so they all started coming out like, yes, the same with hairdressers as well. Like, I think it's the Popeye effect, because apparently there's a culture in Popeyes in Atlanta, I think it might be.
Yeah, Popeyes.
Yeah, where it's like mostly run by black
employees.
There we go, thank you. Run by black employees, and apparently the way they treat customers is really poor, like it's really bad. And so some people are saying that now that they own their own businesses, they now have like no limits on how rude or how bad they can be because they don't have an employer. And so some people call it, they've now dubbed it like the Popeyes effect, which is basically this idea that black people just don't treat other black people well. It's almost as if we don't think we deserve good customer service. And it was interesting to watch Americans talking about it, because there were some black Americans saying that they reckon maybe this might be something that they've been conditioned to do because of segregation and stuff, and like maybe during the days of segregation where black people were kind of told they weren't allowed in certain spaces, and when they were in there they were treated badly, like maybe they've internalized that. I don't find that really compelling because, like you said, you've experienced the same things in Britain. We don't have the same history.
Yeah.
And I've also had situations where one of my aunts is a midwife, and she openly says that when she gives black women instructions on what they should do, they don't listen to her. But when she's told by a white midwife or something, all of a sudden they're like, oh, hi, and like super friendly. So it's like this really interesting thing where it's like, it reminds me of a speech by Malcolm X where he said like he's not interested in convincing black people to be accepted by... He's not interested in convincing white people to accept black people because he thinks black people need to learn to accept and love themselves. Yeah. And they need to like start building their own things rather than asking people to give them things. Yeah. And it was really interesting because watching all of this discourse just kind of reminded me of that speech. And it's kind of made me think like for some black people there's too much of an emphasis on other people accepting us, but really the conversations that we should be having is why are we not that nice to each other? Because even with other things like colorism and criticizing people's features, most of the people I saw calling people bleak and like criticizing how dark their skin is or what their nose was like or their lips was other black people. So I do think there's like a conversation that needs to be had when it comes to all of that, because I think there's way too much projection and not enough like internal.
The sad thing is, like, I guess the people who know that, and I believe that there are many black people who know exactly what you're talking about, it's where they have that conversation, because to have that conversation in public as far as they're concerned is to give ammunition to the opposition, and that's what they don't want. And so we know, many people should I say, know all of this is going on underneath the surface. You know, I've often thought that a lot of the issues that we see happening in various black communities, to me, is less of a political one and more of a personal one.
I agree.
You know, more of a self-esteem issue, more of a way that we've come to think of ourselves. And, you know, there's a myriad of things that influence that. But back to maybe the poor customer service, I do wonder if some of that is rooted in our notion of seeing us all as family.
Yeah.
You know, we're all bro, we're all sis, and of course with your brother and sis you can relax, sure, because you get it. You know what I mean? And there are some elements of that can be quite beautiful, I must say. Like, let's say when I'm walking around, I have locks, and so other people with locks will often acknowledge me. They must say, I must say I like it. I do. Or, you know, sometimes I can just be on the train and a random black girl just smile at me for no other reason than something that she believes that we share. And maybe we don't share that, but I appreciate the smile all the same. But the flip side of that, the trade-off, you know, is this kind of, well, because you're like me and you know what I've been through, like, I don't have to try as much, you know, or you get it, you know, and so for that reason, just, you know, standards drop. But I don't think it's necessarily from the people who are enacting this bad service. I don't think it's obviously them going out of their way to be bad, just as much as this is what they think they can get away with.
Yeah.
You know, because
I think it's really interesting that you said that. That's really interesting and insightful, actually, because when you... Because it makes sense, because there are some people who I know who've tried to start black their own. I don't like calling it black owned business. It's just a business owned by a black person. But like they find that black people try and ask for special favors and like try to like hustle with prices and stuff. But they would never do that with someone else. But I guess it goes back to what you're saying. It's this idea of like viewing each other as like a community or family or something. Yeah. So you kind of you're a lot more casual, and you don't really think about it in like a more professional way like you would with other people.
Yeah, and I think that is a really interesting point. I guess, the problem that I have is that when we attack other people for, like, as you said, seeing that market. So you mentioned the online discourse, I saw something similar as well. There was basically a white woman that was doing goddess locks or got this particular hairstyle, and she was charging a lot of money for it, but she was getting a lot of black female customers. And I saw all of the comments were saying, why are all of these black women using this woman who's also charging you way more? And many of the response of these women was because they were saying again that they don't want someone chewing gum in their ear whilst they're doing their hair, all this kind of stuff. They will pay more for a better experience. And we shouldn't have that people were trying to say that this white woman was essentially culturally appropriating, profiting off of black culture. And actually no, like, people are just going to respond to what is out there. And I think there is a problem when we essentially accuse Asian people, white people of being racist for essentially responding to a problem that we may have contributed to creating. And I think that is, again, in that issue with the Peckham situation, blanketing, Asians as exploiting things that proliferate in the black community, I think is, again, passing blame to the wrong people.
And it's also interesting because if they didn't cater to a black market, then they would be accused of excluding black people and, and not including
exactly
them. So you have a white woman who can do, because I've seen something similar with a woman who does silk presses, and you find black women traveling miles to go to this woman because she's so good and her service is really good, and you see people, because she promotes herself on TikTok, and you see people in the comments complaining, saying why is she taking business away from black people, blah blah blah. But it's like, if she wasn't doing silk press and she was one of those hair, because there are some salons that don't know how to do black hair, and if she would be criticised for that because she's not inclusive. But now she's doing that, and now she's been criticised for doing it. So you really can't win.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I notice is when you are black and you do try to raise your level of professionalism on towards other black people, there's almost this sense of, who do you think you are? Like you're getting above your station.
Yeah.
Like crabs in a bucket.
Yeah. And I think that's also, a big problem that I notice as well.
Where do you think that stems from? Like, do you have any theories on?
What about this? Who do you think you are thing?
Like, why do you think that when they start to see black people rising, they have to find a way to try and they'll either make them an exception, like they'll say like, oh, that's a token example, token success story, or they'll try to, like you said, kind of bring them down. But like, where do you think?
It's that conflict again before you answer. I mean, if you think that the whole system is rigged against you or not for you, then anyone that's cooperating with that system, or anyone that you see as successful, you then automatically think, well, they are selling out in some way or cooperating with that system, and that's not a black thing, right? When you have things like black capitalism, or capitalism is racist, or capitalism isn't for us, then obviously to succeed in this economy and this system, you have to play by the current rules. And and I like what you said about this kind of blaming other people for succeeding. It's not just in a racial aspect, it's just generally, you automatically assume that those who are successful are somehow exploiting, and you don't see that actually maybe it's the better service, maybe it's the longer hours, maybe it's the hard work and just and I see this, we throw this word around a lot, right? Politics of resentment, but unfortunately I see it a lot within the so-called black community. So I think that's why I to answer that question, you see someone doing well, and it happened to Jay-Z, right? Jay-Z gets a lot of flack for being really successful. He did a Twitter space, and I listened to the recording of it. And he was, he was basically saying, because it was around the time of taxing the rich and all that, and he was saying,
eat the rich.
Yeah, eat the rich. And it's like, what do you mean eat the rich? We just got here, like black people. And he got a lot of flack for saying that. Oh, these are the ones that, they think that we've got here. No, you've got there. And it's like this constant, not accepting that it's okay to be successful and rich.
Oh, do you know what? It actually reminds me, even like I don't get it as much now, but I remember like during 2020 time, people would always say to me, black people would say, oh, they'll turn on you at some point, all this kind of stuff, like saying that the support that one might have amongst certain white people is always conditional, and things like that. And it did make me think that, like, similar to what you were saying about if a black person might think differently or choose to approach something a different way, I think some people see it as like delegitimizing their own like struggle narrative essentially. And again, how can you really, yeah, exactly, how can you fight?
To answer your question though, from what you said before, where I think it comes from, I think there are far too many people who think professionalism is synonymous with whiteness. And so once you start, conducting yourself in a way that is widely regarded as professional, one might think that you're trying to act white, and that's where the "who do you think you are" may come from.
That is really interesting. And speaking of Jay-Z, it kind of made me think, you know how some people, when they see a successful person, they have to like say they're like satanic or something, like Illuminati.
Yeah.
It's like, it makes me wonder if maybe there are just some people who are just drawn to these extraordinary explanations as to why someone's successful, to make them feel a bit better about why they're not successful. So it's like, I could be successful too, but I'm not willing to sell out or whatever. It's just kind of like a good way to kind of feel better about why you're not there despite wanting to be there. It's just like, well, it's because I'm real, that's why I'm not on that level with Jay-Z and stuff like that. Because you see a lot of people making, because the Illuminati comments, I've never seen them really thrown at white people. It's sort of like, it's Jay-Z, Rihanna.
Yeah, Rihanna, I remember that. Beyonce.
It's like Chris Brown. Like, it's always targeted at them. And so I wonder if there's kind of like there's a connection there with those two things.
Yeah, I mean, quickly before we move on, but we might touch upon this later, but I just don't see any other ethnicity or community to the extent that black people do, like, doing this kind of thing. Like, I feel like we constantly uplift people that are like morally questionable, like people that I think sometimes we will uplift and valorize people that are in popular culture that are more traditional ideas of success. But I think we still consistently, when I say we, obviously I mean it in a general sense, consistently as a culture idealize, valorize people that I think are morally dubious. Yeah,
it's true. We do make not the best people martyrs, because like there are so many great success stories of black people everywhere. Like it's ridiculous now to say you can't succeed as a black person when there are so countless examples. But when it comes to who organizations like BLM, for example, want to champion, they're not exactly the people with the best histories or best track records. And that is also, it's like even with the Peckham women, like why did they choose to why did they choose to turn up in droves for her? Yet when one of their biggest support, like one of their biggest organizers of BLM, Sasha Johnson, when she was shot, there was no one who turned up to her. The thing that her family tried to put together was like under 20 people.
Yeah, the vigil.
Because I didn't, there was a young girl in Croydon this year who got stabbed. Remember that story? I don't know if there were protests.
There weren't any protests.
No, that's really sad.
There weren't any protests for that. But so I'm gonna move on.
No. So a different tone, a different topic. So this is about Notting Hill Carnival. Now I'm a big fan of Notting Hill Carnival. I'm going on as if I go over there. I've actually only been once. But as many people know, it's this kind of Afro-Caribbean carnival that happens in the summer. And each year, loads of people get arrested, quite a few people get stabbed. Some people actually do even die because, certain wrong-uns do actually end up going to this festival because anyone can go. Like, there's no tickets or anything like that. But oftentimes the headlines are like, we need to cancel it. These... diversity is not our strength, black people are animalistic, all this kind of stuff. And and I want to know what everyone's take is, because I guess for me, like, I partly grew up in London, mainly grew up in Kent, but always had lots of friends in London. And growing up, like, reggae, dancehall, bashment was like very much part of the culture, and I always, it reminds me of that. Like, it makes me feel a bit nostalgic, so I quite like it. But again, similar with the Peckham thing, multiple things can be true at once. You can like Notting Hill Carnival, recognise that maybe there needs to be much better policing to make sure that people are not carrying weapons and using it to sell drugs and all this kind of stuff. And also just think, some of the headlines around this does have racist undertones. So what do you think? Ada, do you want to start?
I agree. I think there has to be a balance with everything, but there isn't nowadays because, you know, the outrage industry feeds on that kind of reaction and, you know, dividing people into camps. But I personally have been to Notting Hill once, and that was my last time. I personally didn't enjoy it, but I wouldn't frame it as a gang-ridden, you know, drug culture because I just didn't enjoy it for different reasons. But one thing I don't like as well is this constant comparison. So, for example, you had someone saying, well, in Glastonbury, you know, there's this amount of... But I think the crime is a bit different to what people get arrested for in Glastonbury and what people get arrested for in Notting Hill. So I think there are genuine concerns. Like, I don't think anyone has ever been arrested for stabbing someone to death in Glastonbury, but feel free to...
maybe not in those numbers,
not
certainly.
in those numbers, but it's kind of a regular in Notting Hill. And I think dismissing that completely is also disingenuous because these things are happening. You know, when people say, oh, why are you only showing these videos? I get it, but these videos are still showing incidents of something. It's like the Nella Rose thing, if we're going to touch on this, but it's like people saying that, you know, I get asked, but it's not fair that they're only showing the bad clips of her. And I'm saying, but it's still her doing those things. So I think, as Denzel Washington always used to say, if it's really the system or if it's really this against you, stop helping it, right, with your own actions and behaviour.
Ayisha?
Yeah, so I grew up going to Carnival. I loved Carnival. That was always something I really looked forward to. And I haven't been that much in recent years, but, you know, at least I've been to Carnival about 10 times in my life. And I do read those headlines, and there is, you know, I think it would be disingenuous to think that there isn't a racial undertone in some of the headlines that you see. You know, there's almost expected to be violence there. People frame it as a kind of a festival of just violence and decadence and things like that, which is fundamentally a misunderstanding of just different types of cultures and the things that we enjoy and the ways that we move and things like that. Not everything has to be, you know, what may be perceived to some people as just like inherently kind of just degenerate and sexual. That's not necessarily the interpretation that a lot of people have. I agree with you. I think you're right. Like, I don't think we can, because I don't remember the number, but was it something like 9 stabbings? I don't think any of them.
1 death, 1 fatality.
Yeah.
Was this in the most recent one?
Yeah, the most recent one. And I do think that is, like, I mean, in general, knife crime is something that we've never really, in my opinion, had honest conversations about. And so long as we're not prepared to have honest conversations about that, I do think that, and so long as we're not prepared to have honest conversations about that, and so long as, you know, Carnival does, you know, have these frequent sort of incidents happening, it's hard to escape that, because people are not just looking at Carnival, people are looking at Carnival and people are looking at the demographics of young people who are either victims of knife crime or perpetuating knife crime. You know, it's all feeding into the same thing. You know, and so if Notting Hill Carnival, if that existed in isolation and the other stuff around it, all the violent crime, all the violent knife crime around it didn't exist, I think we might have a different reading of Carnival. But I think it's because of all of that as well that feeds those headlines and makes people naturally assume that before it's even begun that it's going to be carnage. But I do think people, when we are talking about the crime that happens and things like that, I think people shouldn't be as eager to just sweep it under the carpet. And I don't think people either should just frame it as that's the entirety of the event. The entirety of the event is just, you know, young people, you know, just behaving badly and, you know, wanting to kill each other.
No, it's not true.
There's a lot of violent crime, you know, going on at Notting Hill Carnival, or they're defensive when people do bring up like serious youth violence and knife crime within some sections of the black community.
Yeah, I think there are some people who kind of view it as I don't want to use the word microaggression, but they kind of view it as you're trying to paint black people in like a bad light by highlighting it. But I agree with everything that you just said in regards to if we're going to have an honest conversation about the kind of bad stuff that happens in Nottingham Carnival, there's a whole bigger conversation to be had about knife crime and stuff, especially considering, you know, the biggest victims of knife crime are young black men, and the biggest perpetrators are young black men too. And so, you know, it's one of those things where it is something that is, if we truly are going to say we care about black lives, that is something that we should really address. Like the young girl who got stabbed, like stuff like that needs to be, it shouldn't be, the problem I have with a lot of this stuff is that it gets talked about and then it just kind of disappears. Like people show outrage for it for a little bit and then it just kind of fades into the background. We just move on to the next day. And I think that is an issue, but I do agree that if you do try and bring it up, it gets disregarded as a right-wing talking point. That's the word I wanted to use, not microaggression. It gets disregarded as a right-wing talking point because what they're more interested in talking about is the violence that's perpetuated against black people by non-black people. So for example, the Asian man who got into an altercation with the woman, that will go on for a long time. Protests are coming out and all sorts. If a white person was to do it, that again will go on for a long time. Protests will come out for that. But then when it's black people doing it to each other, that's not really something people are interested in. Even with the Sasha Johnson case, like even politicians were coming out and speaking out because they didn't know that the perpetrator was a black man.
Yeah, Diane Abbott. Yeah, she said no one should be killed, victim for fighting for racial justice.
Yeah.
And then when they found out it had nothing to do with that, she was still
silent. And so it does kind of raise the question of how many politicians try and use this stuff more so for political for political gain as opposed to actually caring about the issue. And also, can we really truly say that we care about the things that happen to us if we're not also going to address the harms that we do to each other? Because I don't see why you can't address both, why you can't address the ones that are done to us by other people but also address the ones that are done by us. But often when you try and raise that, people will just dismiss it as a right-wing talking point, so that is often dismissed. Do
you know, I think the point about the wider kind of glorification or sweeping under the rug, you know, violent crime, I think it's such an important point because it's so frustrating. Like, I have spoken to people that do work, like other black people that do work in like this area, like youth work and stuff like that, and obviously a lot of them are doing a lot of great work, but a lot of the conversations still stem around like, you know, the system is against them and that, you know, they're various system related issues. And I think, okay, fine, I'm sure, you know, regardless of race, there are different social factors that can contribute to you being involved in crime or whatever. But like, it is so frustrating. It's like, why doesn't anyone want to talk about, you know, are there anything culturally that is contributing, you know, whether that is, I'm not going to blame like grime music or something like that, but let's even just talk about the fact that that is the predominant type of musical form amongst young black people, you know, various different cultural elements, and the lack of, you know, community and individual responsibility in that area when we're literally talking about kids stabbing each other, you know, the most gruesome form of nihilistic violence. Like, is there, you know, why are we refusing to actually just speak frankly and honestly and deal with that? If we care about black life, as you said, if that's what we care about, to me that is one of the most prominent ways in which black life is being disregarded. Or am I just like,
I think maybe it gets disregarded because then you would have to investigate the things that you enjoy and potentially part with some of them, or at least be honest about them, and at least be honest about the impact it has. And a lot of those things that you might enjoy, or the things that perpetuate these attitudes, might be very cool. You know, they might bring a certain amount of cultural capital and currency and things like that. And who doesn't, well, not who doesn't, but many people care about being cool. You know, many people care about having some claim to the culture. And when I mean the culture, I mean that in a sort of music, fashion, TV, all of media stuff and entertainment. And so I think that's why as well, you know, I think it's uncomfortable because we would have to, we'd have to take responsibility in some way. You know, I grew up on a lot of violent, you know, music in many ways, and I was able to, rephrase that. I grew up, you know, with a lot of music that had a lot of violent content that at the time, you know, I didn't really think that much about. But growing up, you know, you do have to grapple with it. You do have to, you know, wonder, you know, what is going on here, you know. And a lot of people will say, you know, some elements of the culture that may promote violence, they're just telling honest stories. But I don't know if that's true, because if it was an honest story, you would talk about the desperation, you would talk about the fear that leads you to do these things. And so I think when we are trying to point at things that could be a factor, and I agree there's a factor of things that might influence the attitudes that lead someone to murder someone. But yeah, I just think often we just ignore it. Sorry, I think I lost my point. I think often we ignore it just because, it's uncomfortable and it means we have to change, or something that we're doing has to change.
Facing yourself, looking yourself in the mirror, and actually, it's easier to project onto other people, but when you actually have to look at yourself, that now requires work. If you acknowledge it, you have to do something, so it's just easier just to not acknowledge it altogether. Because doing the work is harder. I think asking other people to give you stuff or asking people to change is a lot easier than getting yourself to. So I think I also really found your point interesting where you said we have to reassess what we think is cool, because that's also a really good point as well, because with the music that people are celebrating, even gang culture is seen as like a status thing in many communities. So I do agree that is also.
And I think we're just, as much as people don't like that point, I just think, you're being so profoundly disingenuous, like to an insane degree, to act like, that isn't the case. Exactly what you said, that there isn't some sort of glorification of, or there's a warped idea about what it means to be tough. That's very influential on many people. And that is a massive factor.
Yeah, no, I think it is true. And just like, again, I don't want to disregard some of the work that people are doing, but I've seen some of these guys that go into schools that are ex-gang members, and a lot of the time they'll still be doing this kind of gangster behavior, but are saying, oh yeah, but I got out of it, you don't have to do this, but you're still embodying and representing all of the things, as if you can just have one bit without the other. You have to be honest about all of the ways that kind of contributes to the culture. And I just think it is sad as well, because I do think there have been points, obviously American history is not the same as UK, but there are overlaps, but there have been points where, at least in the mid 20th century during the civil rights movement, there were black leaders and figures that expressed a huge sense of agency that transcended a lot of the stereotypes and the narratives, and said actually that there is another future possible. And I think that sense of collective and individual overcoming of the historical and present suffering, I don't think we have that narrative in the same way anymore. The only narrative is one-sided. It's victim, it's downtrodden. There isn't a story of agency. There isn't a story of transforming your conditions to be something beyond what other people expect. And when people do have that, I think they're often treated with suspicion.
Yeah, they are. I was tempted to say that a lot of people who may have that opposite view, I think sometimes through being frustrated by being insulted, by having their identity and the legitimacy of their identity questioned, I think get really jaded. And so when they are putting out these messages, it's loaded with a lot of resentment, a lot of scorn, a lot of disdain, and you can feel that. Even if it's not actually in the words, you can feel when someone is kind of coming from that place. But then at the same time, even when that's not there so much, you know what I mean? I do think, you are treated with suspicion. Again, I do think these conversations happen easier offline. When you're speaking to people one-on-one. It's very rare that I'm speaking to someone one-on-one and, they won't or at least they're not so eager to call you an Uncle Tom or to call you a fascist or, tap dancing for the white man or whatever. But I think, online, there just doesn't seem to be that many people who can positively, express those views without being treated with a lot of suspicion at best.
I agree, and sadly it doesn't just stop with politics, because it's so many different things. I've seen people say that they've been called not black because of the way they talk or the way they dress or the interests and hobbies that they take up. It's as if we seem to be the group that our identity is tied to everything outside of our skin color in a way. So it's like, yeah, your skin color is like a big factor of you, but the legitimacy of your skin color is determined by what you like and what you talk like and who you hang around with and what kind of music you like and all this kind of stuff.
Who you date.
Yeah, who you date as well.
Yeah.
It's like other races are allowed to express individuality and to explore their identity without having their identity questioned. But then for some reason, when you're black, there's a very specific expectation that you're expected to meet, otherwise are you really black? Like, you know, have you seen that video of that woman? that girl, that university student who asked a black person who came to give a talk if he was actually black, if he identified as black.
Oh, I saw that,
yeah, because of his views and stuff like that. It's like why should your views or your interests or how you dress or whatever, like, why does that determine whether or not you are legitimately black? And then that happened to, there was a politician who was accused of not being legitimately black.
Oh, Kwasi Kwarteng by Rupa Huck, I think her name was. Said she
private school
and was well spoken. She said he was superficially black.
That was it. And it's like, but why would that even cross your mind to say? But the thing is, when I see non-black people doing that, it's irritated. But at the same time, it's like we do it to each other. So it's like,
it's what they've learned it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like you can't really be. It's one of those things where it's like I don't like it, but I also understand why they feel comfortable to even do it. You know, like the whole Uncle Tom accusations and stuff like that. It's not limited to black people who are doing that. There's white people doing that too to other black people. And it's like, where did you get that? They've obviously seen us doing it to each other, so they think it's acceptable. And I just think it's wrong because there is no right way to be black. I don't like that idea at all.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into the next subject. So this is about the South African singer Tyla. And she has blown up like over the last year through social media, through her song Water. And the interesting thing of why we're talking about this is rather than identifying as black, and she has African ancestry, she's mixed African, European and Asian, I think. And she doesn't identify as black, she identifies as coloured. And in South Africa, they have a different racial category system, partly the legacy of apartheid. They have black for essentially like fully black people, coloured for mixed race people, and I think they have white and Asian. And obviously that is very different in America, who historically have had the one drop rule, where even if you were 1/32 black, that meant you were black, and that means if you had blonde hair, blue eyes, you could be considered black. And that's why you have this range of someone from Shaquille O'Neal to Ice Spice, you know, all identifying as black, whereas that would be very different if they were in South Africa. So loads of black Americans, essentially on Twitter, were saying that, accusing Tyla of culturally appropriating because she adorns, you know, cornrows, even though she is literally of African heritage. They were saying that if she wants to market herself in America, she needs to identify as black. There were some people that were even saying that, oh, if you got stopped by the police in America, they'll see you as black. And we're essentially trying to police her identity. And for me, this was really shocking because first and foremost, like, she is a woman from Africa. So I feel like if anybody, she can define herself through whatever lens that she wants to. And actually, this is a great opportunity to learn about African history and another history to your own. And actually, it's very sad that it's yet another example of the kind of Americanized view of race, trampling over any historical, cultural specificity, even of African people, and them being conformed to a particular notion of how they should identify. So, Ayisha, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, again, I think this really reveals many black Americans, like, just disinterest, ignorance of the ways that other people around the world identify. I mean, I know there are some black Americans who don't even believe that anyone who is not a descendant of slavery should even call themselves black, you know. And so it's, you know, I think the part that really annoys me in everything that you've said when you gave that summary is this idea that you should identify based on how others perceive you. You know, I really dislike that. So just because someone else might treat you as a black person, I guess what they mean by that is treat you negatively, that person's view of you is more important than the reality of your identity. You know, like, that makes absolutely no sense to me. with some of these things, I think sometimes they're just so stupid.
Yeah.
I just don't even know where to begin. But it's just ridiculous. And the word coloured and the term people of colour for a lot of people who are not, there's no meaningful difference.
But it is different because people is first.
It is interesting though, because actually when I was writing an article about this for Spikes, I remembered this term mulatto, which is a term to describe mixed race people, and in America that term is regarded as offensive and outdated, but in South America that is considered a source of pride. If you're mulatto, it just means you're mixed race, and it just shows that you can have different words have different meaning, and it's fine to be aware that the word coloured has its historical legacy in Britain and America, but that doesn't mean that you should that is the same for other people, and that's just fine. And on the point that you just made about defining yourself how other people perceive you, I think is such an important one. When I was reading Self-Portrait in Black and White, Thomas Chatton Williams' book, he talks about the fact that obviously in America he's a mixed race man, he's black, but when he goes to France, people oftentimes think he's from the Middle East, and so because people think he's from the Middle East, does that mean that he should identify as Middle Eastern? And it's the same logic as you've said in the past. Why should you define yourself through the eyes of people that don't like you? So if you're talking about police racism, so you should just embrace a racist police officer's view of you just because it exists, and that's what the logic essentially means.
It's an opportunity just to expand your understanding and your view of the world, and it should be exciting. I don't know if you guys remember the whole thing about the Negro thing as well, and you see, you even backed up.
But they still use that in Spain.
Yeah,
and
that is the word.
It's the Spanish word.
It's the Spanish word for black, and there was a whole thing about Criolla, and that one of their colours is Negro, and it was a white woman, and she had a whole thing about it. And you need to understand that there are other countries, and there's a greater world outside of your own. And I will be honest, because my partner speaks Spanish, and when he said it, it's a bit odd to me, but it's not going to change because I have a feeling or I feel a way about it. That's how it
just is, yeah.
Right? And so I find it quite bizarre that a lot of people feel that they can monopolize, a certain viewpoint or how people identify themselves. Now, one thing I do want to touch on that I do find interesting about going with how, because identity is a give and take, isn't it? It's not just how you decide to portray to the world. It is also how people relate to you as well. Because I say that because when I came to this country, for a long time I struggled to identify as black, it didn't make sense to me.
It didn't
connect because that's not how we did it. So I even until today, in some degree, I do it for convenience. I'm not going to, no, I'm not black, I'm African kind of thing. And that is exactly what Tyla said in one of the interviews. Yes, in America, I know it's offensive, so I'm not going to, any opportunity kind of say I'm coloured. But yes, if I'm doing a video or it's like a personal self-expression, then I'm going to go back to my roots and my heritage. So there is that balance and give and take. But the main thing is about respect and understanding how people choose to identify themselves from where they've come from.
There's also, to play devil advocate, just on your point, there were some people that were saying, well, in a globalized world, international marketability, if America is this huge market, then to some extent you would have to adapt to appeal to a particular audience. And I don't know what people think about that. I mean, personally for me, I'm very skeptical of that because firstly, America is so dominant. Does everyone have to essentially subsume everything about themselves in order to appeal to this American market? But at the same time, just because America does many Americans believe that doesn't mean that we shouldn't question it as well. For example, the one drop rule, that's got questionable origins. Why should a mixed race person necessarily have to identify as black? Because in America they'll be perceived that way. So there is that argument that's I've seen some people try and make nuance that, it's just what people do in order to appeal to a different market. But I personally think that I don't really buy that. What do you think? Do you buy it?
I just think it's interesting how people who have the most negative to say about imperialism seem to have a very imperialistic mindset when it comes to cultural issues, because just because you view something in a certain way does not mean the whole entire world has to view it that way. Well, I'm Zimbabwean, and in southern African countries calling mixed race people coloured is pretty normal. Like, my family lives in South Africa as well, and so I've been around that as well, and it's not offensive, it's not derogatory, it is just a matter of fact. It is just like saying mixed race. Like, there is no emotional connotation to it, and I think it is a case of just accepting that some people have different connections to words, like they're not universal, in the same way that the N-word is not universal. Not all black people around the world find the N-word offensive. They have their own racial slurs that they have an emotional relationship with. So I don't think that we should necessarily squash out other cultures just because other cultures don't like it, because I've seen stuff like this. Stuff happens all the time on social media. There was a German mixed race girl who titled her video "Dark Skin Fairy" because there's like a genre on TikTok, fairy core or something, and she didn't see a lot of like mixed race or black fairies, so she wanted to kind of be part of the representation. But the word that they use in German, there is no word for black in German. So the word that she would typically be, the word that people would use to describe her, translates in English as dark-skinned. So when she put it into Google Translate, it came back as dark-skinned, so she just called herself a dark-skinned fairy. And the amount of black Americans that were in her comments saying, "You're not dark-skinned, you're light-skinned, you're da-da-da," because with America they have all these different categories. They have light-skinned, dark-skinned, brown-skinned, red bone, yellow bone, so it's like, but I don't think they realize that that's not something that is shared across different places. Like, in some, like, for her, she's mixed race, but they would consider her dark skin because she has darker skin. And someone was explaining that in Germany, I don't know, it's quite interesting. They don't have words like this because I think they were trying to explain that there aren't words like this because they don't want to have like racial groups or something. I could be butchering that, but someone could fact check. But yeah, so there isn't a word for black, so it just translates
like racially black.
There is.
I've heard of that.
They don't have that. So you could take it as an opportunity to learn that there are other cultures out there, and the world is bigger than just the USA. But it seems as though we're trying to force people to conform to the to force people to try and conform to your own culture. I just don't agree with it because I don't like it, because I also feel like some people just have this superiority complex, like, because at the same time they'll crap on the West while simultaneously thinking the West knows best, and they try to force other countries outside of the West to conform to Western values and Western norms, and I just find that to be really bizarre. I think I don't agree with that. I think you should just accept that other countries do things differently, and you don't have to agree with it. But you don't have the right to demand that they conform to your way of doing things, because why should they have to? So she wants to call herself coloured because that's probably how she's identified her whole entire life. That's how she's been perceived her whole entire life. That's her normal. Should she now just suddenly change to black just because Americans told her to do so? I wouldn't. Personally.
I've been told, I'm not black by black Americans when, I've had a different opinion, and I think I pinned it on my Twitter once because I was just flabbergasted, So, I mean, it was a so-called contentious thing I said, but I still stand by what I said today. So I was kind of, exploring this separatist language that we have sometimes, like black love and black pain and black joy and things like that. So I just said, it's time to kind of move beyond these kind of separatist language, and racializing quite universal emotions. And the replies I got was, well, you're not black, so you can't talk. So can you understand when someone is black and when someone isn't black?
When they have the right opinion.
Yeah, well, on that point, actually, I've seen this video on YouTube, and it was basically a conversations between like black Americans descended from slaves and recent immigrants. And one of the things that they discussed was the use of the N-word. And some of the black Americans, not all of them, but some of them were saying that they found it uncomfortable when they heard non-descendants of slaves using the N-word. And so you can just keep getting into just so many different levels of policing. So if we're at that point, and on top, not only that, with regards to the N-word, obviously it's a whole nother discussion, but there's obviously that thing about black people use the N-word amongst each other. And there are some black people that actually find the N-word uncomfortable, regardless of whether that is through hip hop or if it was a racial slur. And so why can we not understand context in that instance? If we can understand, oh, well, it's different. Like when someone is saying, oh, you're an N-word versus someone rapping the N-word. Why can we not understand the context of Tyla, which is that in this context, it's totally fine.
Did you see the video of Kendrick Lamar brought on a white fan to sing one of his songs that had the N-word, and she was just in her moment just singing it along, and then he like basically just like started telling her off and like having to go at her on stage.
Wait, was it Kendrick?
Yeah.
'Cause I knew I saw that. I didn't. Yeah, 'cause I think fair enough. 'Cause
I think so, because he brought her on stage to sing, and then obviously she sang the N-word. I don't know what he expected her to do, just be like or something when the
That's
song
what
came
they do
up.
expect.
Well, no, I've literally seen. I saw a video on TikTok of this woman, like, it's so cringe. Like, this black woman at a festival, and she was like saying, it was like about listening out to any of the white people using the N-word. I'm like, so you are literally standing at this festival, not enjoying yourself, just pretending to listen.
N-word, please.
Exactly. I just think, is this not exhausting?
Exercise of power, isn't it? Just like trying to control.
But it's just exhausting. Like, how this is not like. I don't want to make a flippant point, but with all the problems going on in the world, like, I honestly just think, like, to live your life, like, just perceiving the world in this way, like, is no wonder you'll treat every incident with suspicion. No wonder your self-esteem will start to, be undermined, because you're seeing every, there's actually a phrase that I saw on Twitter, which I thought was very good. It was like, essentially seeing the malevolent in the incidental. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to me, that is really encapsulates what is happening right now. I just don't think that is a recipe for any kind of positive moving forward as a society, if we still even have a wider goal.
I think a lot of black people have this idea that unless they are talking about their racial identity, then whatever they have to say isn't important, or that's the most significant intellectual contribution that they can make. And so then you find yourself in this position where anything involving black people, so even this idea, or not even the idea, the sort of reality that we now live in, where any conflict between someone black and non-black will always be seen as racism first. Hence the Peckham shop thing. Rather than seeing this as an incident of someone trying to steal and someone being a bit too forceful. Racism actually needs to come into it at all. But we live in a reality now where we can't see conflict between black people and non-black people without racializing it. And I just wonder if we get to this point where we're just making these ridiculous takes because unless we are making takes about race, then we're not being authentically black, or at least we're not being sophisticatedly black.
So do you think technology also probably plays a role in that as well? Like the concept of having 24-hour news makes people feel like there's always something they need to be addressing or giving their take on. Like, and social media as well, kind of rewarding people who kind of share these kind of takes or have these kind of opinions. These kind of things go viral and they get a lot of engagement, so it kind of encourages people to feel as though their activism just becomes talking about things and not actually doing anything to like fix anything.
Just quickly, I mean, you see that so many now when there's like a big political issue, like if you don't say something, you do see people commenting like, oh, you didn't say anything about this, not going into the conflict in the Middle East, but I've seen that a lot where people have been like, if someone talks about something else, they'll be like, why aren't you talking about this? And I feel like with social media, if you are someone that comments on things or is regarded as a commentator, like, you are massively policed. I think that actually brings the way to this whole audience capture situation, because so many people I've seen now that a few years might have even been moderately reasonable have basically become totally captured by the audience, because there is this huge incentive pull factor to just react, and then you get more and more simplistic takes because more and more people are talking about things because they feel obliged to when they know nothing about that subject.
And before information comes out as well, so they don't even get it right a lot
exactly
of the time because of that.
But then that doesn't change, and that's my biggest problem with a lot of the discourse about anything. They can, immaturely give an opinion or, you know, dissect an issue, so-called, and then when they're found out to be wrong, there's never that, actually, I was wrong. And even on a high level of politicians or high public figures or officials that come out and immaturely give their opinion or decision or just their general view of something, and it's found out to be the complete opposite. And there's no retraction, right? There's no humility. And it's clever because once something is out there, it's out there. And, you know, people have already accepted that as their truth, right? We were talking about the George Floyd thing, you know, recently. And, you know, it's so sad that there's so many inconsistencies and inaccuracies in a lot of these stories, but that doesn't matter. Because to some people, like I think we mentioned either before or now, and it's like it's already confirmed their ideological viewpoint and nothing else matters.
Well, we are almost coming to an end of this podcast, but I think we want to end, I guess, on, we've looked back on all of the controversies, the madness of the last 12 months, but going forward into this new year, it'd be interesting to hear, I mean, what people, are they optimistic or pessimistic about the direction of travel of a lot of these conversations? And if there's one thing that everyone think individually that they think that we need to be talking about when it comes to that we're not paying attention enough about when it comes to many of these racial discussions, what is it? So I'll start. So I feel like I'm optimistic about the conversation. I feel like a few years ago, a lot of people were discussing on Twitter and social media, but many people have become more prominent figures in the public conversation. Lots of books have come out. You know, Tony Saul has a book coming out in March. Coleman Hughes has a book coming out next year. There's lots of people that have had good intellectual work, and I do think this is much more of a mainstream conversation now. And I think one of the things is that I don't want the conversations we're having to be countercultural as such. I want this to be like part of a real public debate. So I do think that is happening. But actually, one thing that I still don't think that we're focusing enough on, and I think we touched upon it in this conversation, I do think that it's a difficult subject, but we do need to talk about like serious violent crime within some sections of the community. And I really still worry about the valorization of the wrong people, much to the disadvantage of like young people growing up about who they should be and how they should shape their identity. So that's my thoughts. Patience, want to go? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm neutral, to be honest. I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, because I have seen some good things in terms of the discussions and the discourses that are happening, mainly within the social media space. But like you said before, there's still this kind of attack on the people who are often sharing these opinions, and there's often the attempt to try and strip them of their racial identity, or to accuse them of trying to distance themselves from their identity or abandon their community and all this kind of stuff. So that is kind of what makes me think, okay, because I get a lot of messages from young black people saying like, I'm so happy to see someone my age talking about these issues. I don't feel comfortable talking about it with my friends because of blah, blah, blah. Like, I think maybe that's what makes me a bit pessimistic, because I think it's a shame that people don't feel comfortable to just be themselves, because they feel they have to be this certain rigid idea of what it means to be a black person. And so I guess that's why I guess I'm kind of neutral. We'll see what 2024 is saying. 2023 did not want to stick around, quite clearly. It's already gone. In terms of what I think we should be talking about more, it was what we were talking about on our way here, which is I would really like us to be able to have conversations about race without it being political, because I do think that there are times when politics makes sense, but a lot of the issues I think we have not, the government can't fix. And so I think that there is an issue of making it political, because then it becomes like this left-wing, right-wing, conservative, liberal issue. But really, it's a lot more than that, and I think it makes it really hard to have that conversation, because when you politicize things, people separate themselves into teams, and then it ends up becoming a case of my team versus your team, as opposed to actually a genuine conversation about these issues and trying to address them properly to resolve them. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think I'm somewhat hopeful. I think I'm somewhat hopeful, maybe based on the conversations that I have in private, maybe more than I have online. And I'm always pleasantly surprised by the amount of people who, I don't know, when you address them, when you meet them where they are, in many ways that you can have these conversations with. And the rise of some of the people that you mentioned, from Coleman Hughes or Thomas Chatterton Williams and other people, Tomiwa, his book and stuff like that. Although I think most of their readers will largely be people already who agree with them. I do think the more prominent they become, a lot of their ideas will seep into other areas, unlikely places. So I am somewhat hopeful, and this could just be because I just haven't been as online in the last year as I have been, but it does feel to me that maybe, although I did ask Patience this earlier, and she disagreed, but it does feel like to me that you might be able to say things now, you might be able to talk off the script on racial issues without always this immediate, you want to be white, or you're looking for a pat on the back by the white man. You don't necessarily think that's the case, and I can see that as well, but I feel like there's more space for that. So I am hopeful. Certainly, I think one of the biggest things that's always meant a lot to me, or has always been very important to me, is addressing the violent crime problem. I think if you care about racism, which many people profess to, I do think that you have to care about the issue of violent crime, because whether rightly or wrongly, it is the thing, probably the main thing, that drives a lot of negative attitudes. And whether that should be the case or not is neither here nor there. It is what it is. And there's just no getting around that. And so there is no combating racism without looking at that. In my opinion, it is a significant factor. So I think we should be speaking about that more, and I think I'm always an advocate for the fact that the issue affecting many people is not so political so much as it is personal. And I know many people would like to say that they're both the same, but I don't think they are. I think this is very much about the ways many people have come to perceive themselves, and I think we should start there.
Ada?
I'm both. So I'm optimistic because there certainly are a lot more voices. In the short space of time I've been in this space, I've definitely seen an increase of people stepping out and saying, actually, I don't agree with a lot of things that's gone on and a lot of things that's happening now. But I am pessimistic because I've just seen that this outrage machine, it's really fed on our reactions, right? And it serves people, whoever these people are. It serves them politically, it serves them financially, socially. So there will always be incidents and events that, are thrown out there to divide, people and sort of extract the most intense emotions from us. And so I'm pessimistic in that sense. In terms of what we should talk about, I think the general things, but I'm not so much interested in that. I'm more interested in the things that how we need to approach these conversations, and also certain things that need to go from our collective psyche so that we can have these conversations better. One is to almost, remove this powerful feel that the word racism has, to white and black. So a lot of white people, they're afraid to enter a conversation. They're afraid to, they're unsure how to maneuver around people or around conversations because of that racism word. They don't want to be called racist. Institutions don't want to be called racist, right? So they make very bad decisions. I don't know if you remember that whole thing with Starbucks where 2 black men got arrested. A white manager that wasn't even there that day was fired because of optics, right? So people are so afraid to be seen. It's like the worst thing that could happen to you now. And I think once we remove this almost stigma, of course racism is a big deal, but this fear of being racist, I think, needs to go. And another thing, I think we need to almost stop hiding behind history. I think that there are some things that are relevant now. There are some things that are the causes can be traced to actually quite recent, and I think it's very convenient to always go back to 400-500 years ago, where actually we can go back 10 years and see what changed, what happened, and that's not to remove, whatever's gone on centuries past, but we need to start being honest that actually some of these things are driven by a culture, and doesn't mean that our culture is, you know, less than, but we need to have those conversations. So.
Thank you so much, Ada, Ayisha, and Patience. Thank you so much, everybody, these wonderful women. We'll put all of their links down in the description box, and keep watching the Equiano pod. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy our videos, why not leave a like and hit the subscribe and notification bell so you make sure that you do not miss an episode.